Um, so everybody should have just noted that there's a pop-up message just mentioning that we're recording Susie's talk tonight. Thanks, Suzie, for allowing that, as long as her angles look good and her
I don't care about angles, I just don't stuff up what I'm going to say.
So a big welcome, everybody, to our first meeting of the year, and thanks for joining us. It's exciting. Hopefully you've all had a good break and recharged the tanks and ready to go. First, I'd just like to start with the Acknowledgement of Country and pay respects to our traditional custodians of the land we meet on, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and always with a heart full of gratitude for their amazing stewardship of this land for millennia. So fabulous to have you here. Before I introduce Suzie, I might just quickly mention some breaking news, which some of you that have been on Facebook or onto your emails may have noticed, that we've made the decision as a committee just to change the format for meetings a little bit this year. We've had a lot of disruption with lockdowns and COVID over the last couple of years. And while Zoom is a great option, we're missing seeing everybody. And we think that the best way to move forward with that, and the least risky way to move forward with that, is to have a daytime gathering of a Sunday on the third Sunday of the month. So what we're proposing to do is go around to different community gardens, and that will be posted well ahead of time. And then just have our sort of show and tell, or maybe a bit more interactive, or maybe a bit of a guest speaker. We'll mix it up a little bit, happening at a community garden or a public place outdoors on a Sunday. So during daylight saving times, it'll be 3 o'clock in the afternoon till 5 on a Sunday. And once we're out of daylight saving, it'll be 2 o'clock till 4 o'clock. And our first one's kicking off on the 20th of March, Sunday, the 20th of March. And Karen Ang, sorry, no, how do you pronounce it? Sandy, help me out. I can't remember. Yeah, will be our guest speaker, and she'll be talking about Asian plants, Asian food plants, and using them. So it'll just be a wonderful cultural event, and I'm hopeful that probably Tanya or one of the lovely Wowo community garden members will give us a bit of a tour around the garden, hopefully, as well. And it's a treat if you haven't visited before.
And there's probably lots of things to forage for.
Yes, yeah, and Karen said she's going to go have a look before that, obviously, to see what's actually there, but I think she's a pretty regular participant there anyway. So that's an exciting development, and possibly for the next couple of months at least, we might still do a Zoom meeting just to you know, transition and just to make sure we're capturing as many people as possible and suiting everybody as much as we can. But we've also got another Zoom talk next Tuesday night, being Morag Gamble, who most people who've been in permaculture for a little while will know, a really amazing permaculture teacher and elder, sort of, not that old, but she's been around for a while in the permaculture movement. She'll be online next Tuesday evening. So that will be a really great event, and she'll be talking about fair share, one of the lesser known sort of, or lesser understood ethics of permaculture. So that'll be really well worth joining for as well. But tonight, we've got the lovely Suzie German here, front and centre on your screens. Suzie is a Permaculture Central Coast member, and she is, as well as being a permaculturist, she's a horticulturist and also a bush regenerator, an edible flower farmer, and just all-round good human being with so much knowledge that she's going to share with us tonight. So I think I'll leave the rest of the introduction to you, Suzie, because I don't think I can do you enough justice with all your hashtags.
I know, I've got to stop, right?
And Susie's going to be talking about exploring the margins, which is going to be a really fantastic session. So I'm sure you'll all join me in making Suzie really welcome. What we're going to do is, leave it to Suzie when she wants to take questions. If you've got burning questions during the presentation, please do pop them into the chat pod, because that way you won't forget the question if Suzie's not yet ready to take them. And at the end, Suzie would be really keen for everybody to stay on for a bit of a sort of brainstorming discussion, sort of a bit more fleshing out questions and ideas. So so that's how it's going to roll tonight. So strap on in and let's make Suzie really welcome and enjoy her beautiful information. Thanks, Suzie. Over to you.
Great. Thanks, Kerry. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Feels really good to be here finally to be able to do this. I really was hoping that it would be a face-to-face, because I think that this is one of those things that you really want to engage all your senses. But I'll do the best I can. I've kind of made it a little bit philosophical. I think that foraging is one of those things that, it has a lot of, romantic notions, but at the same time, when we go to engage with it, sometimes it's more a thing that people do on a theoretical level and don't necessarily bring into their daily or just even their life practices. And I'm hoping that today we can, push those boundaries a little bit and explore those edge effects and margins and get to the bottom of why. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to share my screen and we can go from there. If anyone does want to ask me a question partway through, I'm okay with that. But as Kerry said, I really am hoping that we can then have a bit of a discussion about how everyone feels about foraging. Do you forage, or if not, what are some of the barriers that might prevent you from doing so, and so forth. Okay, let's share this screen. I'm just going to make everyone really tiny so that I can actually see my screen. If anything pops up in the chat, oh no, I can see it, it's up here, great. Cool. All right, so I'm Suzie, and as Kerry mentioned, I wear a lot of hats, I do a lot of things, but my primary passion and focus is in preserving biodiversity and promoting biodiversity. And I think that foraging is one of those things that enables us to care for us and our well-being, as well as providing for nature. So we've already had an acknowledgement to country, but I also just wanted to say, because I don't know many of you, that I wanted to extend that respect of acknowledgement to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples that might actually be present with us today. Bit of an outline. So in order to understand where foraging fits into the system, I think we need to look at how our landscape has changed through time. In doing so, I'm hoping that we can appreciate some of the ecosystem services that we've lost along the way, and what type of consequence that has played on urban biodiversity as a whole. As Kerry mentioned, I've got a background in bush regeneration and land management, and that's a field that I've been working in for the last 25 years. And so a big part of doing that, it has been involved in restoration works. But the more that we move towards embedding more biodiversity into our system and bringing back those ecosystem services, we're looking to build resilience, and sometimes that it needs to be looked at in a different way, I feel. I think that there's a shift occurring, and hopefully, we'll be able to discuss a bit more about that this evening. So that brings us to the nature of the weed, because that's usually the thing that we're most concerned about. For some reason, we identify plants as weeds, sometimes for good reason, but in doing that, we also, create opportunities to engage with them. Certainly we do in our gardens, and for anyone that works in the field that I do, we get out there and work with weeds all over the place. Understanding what it means to be a weed and how we can better engage with those plants. So I think in that respect, and particularly with everything that's been happening lately, it's time to shake up the system a little bit and update the systems that we have in place, the rules that we have with engagement, but also the way that we perceive things, because I think our perception and behaviour, that's the starting point of so much of what we do. And so there's an opportunity there. We'll look at some of the concerns that we might have with things at the moment, but also that with every issue that we have, there are opportunities to explore. And certainly the theme of the talk being valuing the marginal, that gives us, it's a permaculture principle that can guide us and give us, I guess, permission in a way to actually go deep into those spaces and push out and find, I guess, novel ways, new ideas to explore, to be able to actually, bring about some of those opportunities, I guess, into reality. And like with everything, we need to look at the barriers that come up that stop us from being able to engage. And then hopefully at some point I'm going to get to talking a little bit about weeds. So the where, the how, the what and the why. Sorry, I'm just going to move part of my border around because it's actually blocking my screen and I can't see everything. Hopefully it works. Okay, so patterns. Patterns play a really big part in permaculture. Anyone that's studied any form of permaculture will have observed this. And we see this in the way that our landscape changes, from moving from a natural bushland to any form of modification. Even rural areas have experienced modification, all the way through to our built-up environments, our urban areas. And as these landscapes are modified and changed, so too those processes that they offer us, those ecosystem services that they offer us also change. And in some instances, in a negative fashion, for example, with the loss of biodiversity. But in other ways, again, we're always looking to creatively respond to change and opportunities arise, one such example being community gardening. So we're certainly looking at ways that we can embed that biodiversity back into our urban environments. So a bit more about ecosystem services for anyone that may not fully understand that terminology. A lot of you would know about, I guess, the ecosystem services in terms of the benefits that nature provides us, such as food and resources, water purification, air purification, buffering us from environmental hazards and climate change. I live on the peninsula in the lower end of the Central Coast, and our temperatures here are around about 5 degrees higher than surrounding areas, and we're experiencing what is called the heat island effect. And we're experiencing that because of the loss of trees, because trees can moderate our climate. And so that's like a real concern that has a lot of impact on our health. And so another part of our ecosystem benefits that we derive relate directly to our quality of life and our well-being, our mental well-being. And more recently, studies have, proper scientific peer-reviewed studies have been undertaken that look to quantify and understand what some of those benefits are beyond the tangible. So looking at things like how it impacts our mental health and how it impacts our stress levels, and how we can better connect with our communities. And so there is more of a push, and this is being done from, I guess, the bottom up and from the top down in terms of strategies and policies that are being developed big scale in order to embed that biodiversity back into our urban systems. And that can be in the form of tree plantings and creating parks and all sorts of things, greenways, converting existing infrastructure, redefining and repurposing their use to improve some of these benefits. So why am I telling you about all of this, and how does it relate to foraging? Well, it all comes down to how we go about bringing that biodiversity back. In a traditional sense, we've looked at it in the form of ecological restoration, where we take a static view of our environment some point in the past, and we try to replicate that by deeming what plants are suitable and so forth, and what, I guess, the species, mainly the species composition, what's suitable for an environment. But instead, we're starting to find that more and more importantly, we're looking at restoring function instead, because these landscapes have modified so much. And in modifying, in terms of nutrient profile, change to hydrology, change to the light availability, and, just even those edge effects, the way that they meet up with urban landscapes, that they're not always suitable to re-embrace that traditional form. And so if we want to be able to build that diverse community and to increase that resilience, particularly in the face of climate change, we need to start thinking outside the square, and we need to start changing our relationship with what we deem is a weed and what we think should belong. So I guess in that respect, this provides us with an opportunity. These interfaces, these edges that you can see in this picture, this is one of those stock photos that I didn't pay for, and so it's got these lovely spiral patterns on it, which actually reminds me of permaculture anyway, so I don't mind them being there. But you can see from this picture that you've got an urban environment, then you've got a bit of a buffer being the road, some grassy areas, some stone and habitat. It's probably part of a wetland, and then what we can't see in the picture, but as you pan out, it becomes more and more natural bushland. So that interface becomes a space that I think as citizens of our communities, that we should be able to engage with that space. But how do we, and what's considered right and wrong? I guess they're some of the things that we need to look at and understand better. But these areas are going to be wonderful habitat for weeds. And again, that presents us with an opportunity to consider how we want to manage those situations. Do we perceive them as problems and therefore apply traditional methods of engagement and interaction, or do we start looking at them as opportunities that can meet some of our other needs that are being identified? So we need to, as I said before, shake up the system a little bit. We need to update the way that we do things. We need to understand what those rules of engagement are. Of course, there are laws. I've got a page on that, the next page, but there's also etiquette around how we actually choose to forage. And most people that do forage regularly do actually say they've kind of got a bit of a code of conduct that they abide by. And so most people are trying to do the right thing. But we have boundaries, and plants don't know boundaries, but we have boundaries of ownership. And so we need to respect those boundaries, but also understand when opportunity presents itself. But with opportunity also comes responsibility. And when we're dealing with weeds, something that can be a resource that we can utilise, whether it's for food, for fibre, for medicine, or however else we choose to utilise them, where by engaging with those plants, we're also potentially managing infestations and outbreaks. And so I think in that respect, communication is always a great starting point. I quite often get out and about in my neighbourhood. I know my neighbourhood well. I'm getting to know so many more of my neighbours a lot better. And I have those conversations, those like marginal spaces that we get into, those spaces of discomfort where we think I might be a bit embarrassed to ask if they're okay with me grabbing some fruit that clearly happens to be falling on the ground that they're not interested in. But given that it's on their boundary, I don't really have a right to it. So it's those sorts of conversations that I'm referring to. But of course, there are very clear no-nos, and I've got here threatened species cultural knowledge. And by that, what I mean is, I am very much referring to species that act as weeds. Now, that can also be native species, a lot of native species that have moved out of their usual distribution, can often act opportunistically and act as a weed, particularly plants that are colonisers that often like these disturbed landscapes. So threatened species do actually have very clear laws around them, and if you break those laws, then you face potential fining or prosecution. And with respect to cultural knowledge, I've tried as hard as I could to steer away from a lot of Indigenous plants that I do actually forage in the area, because that's not really for me to talk about. But in the instance where some of those plants have become quite widespread and cosmopolitan, such as the pigface in the top picture here, there are quite a few plants that we kind of see around everywhere that, most of us probably utilise. So I referred to some of the legalities. I think the main issues that we really want to be aware of when we engage in foraging is obviously the legalities are really important. Abide by them. If they're clear, abide by them. If they're not clear, then ask questions, have a conversation. Otherwise, some of the main issues around safety include misidentification of plants and, of course, contamination. Now, a lot of people think that anything on public land is probably going to be sprayed because council's out there constantly spraying everywhere, but that's just not true. That's not to say that areas don't get sprayed or areas may have other forms of contamination, such as heavy metal contamination from soil or being against roadsides or areas where dogs pass through, and so you might have other organic contamination. But there are ways that we can address that. So in that case, then, we need to look at some of these barriers that may exist for us. And this is probably a good opportunity for me to ask the audience, if I can see where you are. I'm going to bring you all back so I can see you. Great. Well, I can't actually see you. Everyone's taken themselves off their cameras, or most people have. Some people are there. So does anyone want to jump in and talk about if you do or don't forage, and whether there's a certain barrier to that, or something that you still feel unsure about before you would progress or consider foraging? Anyone?
Yep. Yeah, I'll speak. It's Sandy here. The last point on your previous slide for the safety and contamination reasons, that's kind of why I don't, but also not being absolutely sure about whether what I think it is what it is. Yeah,
absolutely. And they're like the two main things that you want to be really paying attention to, along with, obviously having like permission. I think, and I know I mentioned it somewhere in the talk and I can't remember where it is, so I'll mention it now, and then if we come across it again, we can always skip it. So I think in that respect, yes, they're really good reasons to not engage, but they're not good enough reasons to not start or not try. And I think that obviously becoming aware, it's going to happen through experience. If you start with one or two plants and you get to know them really well, and sometimes a good place to start really is in your own garden. I think often already, without going too far, just at our own, on our own sort of like within our own boundaries, in our own landscapes, we have plenty of edges and plenty of opportunities for those odd colonising plants that or self-recruiting plants that pop up that often we don't even think about, and we pull them out. So starting with that, I think, is a really good place, because you can at least cut out the contamination part pretty quickly. So then it's just coming down to identification, really.
And onion weed. Sorry. Apparently you can eat onion weed. like
Yeah,
onions.
yeah.
So, yeah.
And I think another really good place to start, and this isn't really talking about weeds, but it's something that I'm really into, and I think should be embraced more. And I know a lot of people here do, and that is just utilising more parts of the plant. But there are plants that we know really well, like dandelion, for example. But then I also understand that, one, it can change its leaf shape, and two, there are other confusing species. And so in that sense, you know, some of those confusing species are also edible. But taking photos and sharing it, like tapping into the community, I think is a really good way. And there are a couple of Facebook groups that have amazing knowledge, like members with so much knowledge, and they're just so giving in terms of being able to help with identified plants for you. So I think that definitely there are ways around that. The other thing too is that if actual consumption of those plants are not something that you want to consider, there are still so many other uses that we can derive from foraging that have nothing to do with actual eating.
Yes, I was actually going to make that observation that often when I forage, I'm not necessarily foraging for food. I might be foraging something that's like a really nice succulent or a really good ground cover, and if I'm foraging a food plant, I might be foraging the plant not to eat it now, but because I've got contamination issues, but to plant and then eat it later.
Yeah, absolutely. So sometimes, I mean, that I didn't have any dandelion in my garden, and I just so wanted to have some, and I ended up foraging the seeds and grew them. And now I can't get rid of the thing. So now I'm actually actively weeding and composting, but then I'm still eating as well and consuming. And it's such a great plant because there's so many parts of the plant that you can make use of. But I feel safer knowing that it's coming from my garden. But that's something that we'll talk about, I think maybe in the next slide, that, you know, obviously things that are ground covers are more likely to have contamination, whereas if we're dealing with, say, like a tree species that's fruiting, we may not necessarily have to worry about something like dogweed, for example. But yeah, there's so many ways that we can use the plants. So I think part of that process is also then stepping outside of what we define as a potential use. So yes, knowledge and experience, teaming up with people. I think when you've got a group of people and you're doing it together, you've got more brains to work on reaching a consensus. But one of the barriers, often people will say, look, I just don't have time to do this, or it's too much effort, or it's too much energy. And I think like anything, like starting a garden is a lot of effort and energy in the beginning, and often you wonder whether it's even worth the yield, but eventually you get there and it gets easier and easier. But I also think that's where we can balance some of the other benefits that we derive from it. And definitely palatability. Oftentimes we're dealing with plants that are not things that we usually purchase. And so, and also a lot of the food that we purchase originally had or evolved from a wild type. And so it's been bred to be transportable. It's bred to, be milder on our palates. And so we've kind of, in a way, dumbed down our palates. And as a result of that, missing out on a whole opportunity of really, useful, nutrient-dense and medicinal foods. So that's another one. And we've spoken about safety, so I can skip that one for the moment.
Suzie,
yes,
just a couple of questions. You
mentioned, sure.
You mentioned some Facebook groups, and we're just wondering if you've got any names of those Facebook groups.
Yeah, I have to check it because they've changed their name, but I think it was like Foraging for Food and Medicine in Southeast Australia.
Okay.
And I'm happy to check that, and Edible Weeds, Wildcrafting and Foraging Australia, yeah. That might be it. They may have changed their name to that. I used to be the admin on that group, but it just got too big. But yeah, it's a really good one. There's lots of information there. Sorry,
Great.
were there other questions that I need to?
Yeah, there's
so-
Sandra just says, I'm interested in foraging seaweed, but unsure of safety.
Okay.
And
Yep.
Barbara has said to eat or compost, question mark.
Okay, sure. So Sandra and Barbara will actually get to that a bit later because that's something that I do. So I'm happy to talk about that. Cool. Okay, so I'll just minimize this again and proceed. So just in case anyone's interested, the pictures on the side, they're both me modelling. The top one, that's just wood sorrel, and the flowers have a nice lemony flavour, and that's actually growing in a friend's garden. So, feel free to forage in safe places. There are plenty of safe places. I think the minute you start to think about it and make a conscious decision to go out and explore and see what you can find, you'll undoubtedly come across stuff. And then the other one is actually it's not in bushland, but it's on the edge of bushland, and it's a common weed that grows on the coast. It's called turkey rhubarb is the common name. And the very, very, very young leaves, it's got like an arrow-shaped leaf. Those tips, so the very young leaves have a really beautiful sorrel flavour as well. So again, a nice lemony flavour, and you can eat them fresh or cooked. So that's often more like a snacking thing. If I'm walking past, and I'll just pick a leaf and eat it. Understanding our barriers also then means that we can look at them as opportunities to explore those margins. So looking at the edge of our attitude, like is our attitude and our thoughts and our beliefs and our societal norms around foraging the things that limit us. That's something that we can consider. We can definitely redefine or expand our palette. And sometimes I think with foraging, it's important to appreciate that plants change their taste even throughout the day, but certainly throughout the season, certainly based on where they're growing. So I don't think you can try one dandelion leaf, for example, and go, okay, that's it, it's just not for me. It changes its flavour profile. And so maybe that's something that you can experiment with and work out which parts of the plant you prefer or which time of day. So often, younger leaves have a more gentler flavour, but you might use them differently. The young leaves, for example, you might use in a salad, and the older leaves you might actually use to make like a compost tea, or you might use it in cooking. So, for example, to make like a quiche or a pie or something else. We respond creatively, basically, to what's available. And part of the description of this talk was creatively exploring and utilising the abundance. So try to keep that in mind when you're out foraging. Recently, there's been a lot of stuff that I've been reading about. And in fact, just this morning, I read about an article that was talking about this, an affordability crisis. Food is becoming so much more expensive that there's a genuine a crisis in affordability of food. And so it's limiting people in terms of what they can buy and what they and the diversity and variety of what they can eat. On the flip side of that, if that's not a concern for you, a lot of us are experiencing, you've got the money to buy, but the supply is not there. The shelves are empty. And so we're collectively looking outside of the box to explore other ways to gain access to food. And so I think, again, foraging is one of those things that can help to supplement what we have and what we can access as well. And it's great because everything's out there now, and we've been getting rain, and so it's like a perfect time and opportunity to be able to do that. But we need to also think about how we interact with the land, as I mentioned previously. Sometimes it's hard for me to appreciate and understand because I've worked on public land and private land. I've worked in national parks. I've worked all over the place. And so I must admit sometimes those boundaries of land ownership get a bit blurred for me because I have permission. If I'm on land doing something, then I'm there because I have permission to be there. And if my I guess my process of foraging is actually me doing my job of weeding or harvesting or removing a weed or collecting seed or whatever the case might be. I end up having access to a lot of these things. And so I understand that for a lot of people that don't have that opportunity to interact with the land around them, that it can seem like a weird thing to do. But I also want to, encourage you to find out more about your local area and also to kind of appreciate the ownership of the area. I'll talk a bit more about that in the next slide. And as always, communication is a really important thing. Okay, so where do we forage then? Well, I actually had a little joke about this and then I removed it because my son said that it was a bit geeky. And I had something about exploring the dimensions of time and space because I'm such a Doctor Who fan and a sci-fi nut. But it's so true. That's what we need to do when we think of where. We think of it in the context of horizontal space. We think of it in terms of strata, so ground cover, mid-story, canopy. But we can also think of it in terms of time, and that time can be in terms of time of day. It can be in terms of seasons, and it can also be in terms of the timing of the life cycle of a plant that we're working with or that we're interested in. So, for example, a lot of green leafy things that we may be able to forage tips of and eat, and they're quite palatable. When they're flowering, they may be very unpalatable, or the leaves may reduce in size and it's just not really economical. But that can present a different opportunity. It can present an opportunity to then shift from the leafy green part of the plant to, say, the seeds, for example. And also, more and more people are growing plants on their verges. And I know that at the moment we've got something happening on the coast. Meg started that process and everyone has jumped on board, and I hope everyone's jumped on board. And it's with council now. And so it's something that we're hoping to actually create change in. But then what do you do with that space? Does that space become free for all? I guess these are some of the things that we need to think about. And I certainly think that the more that we forage, and foraging isn't just about taking, it's not just about being opportunistic and looking at what resources are available and cashing in on it. Foraging can be very much about the gift of giving. When we have an abundance of resources that we just simply can't make use of, then it leads to waste. And one of our permaculture principles is that we want to minimise waste. But also it ties in with the key ethics of permaculture where we have that fair share. And so I think that the whole verge movement on the coast can potentially be a safe place to interact, engage, learn, exchange, and utilise. Getting to know your area, I think, is a really good thing to do. Exploring those marginal spaces, the boundaries of your property. Oftentimes when you start hitting walls and boundaries, you notice that everyone's got a corner somewhere where maybe it's a little bit untidy or whatever the case might be. And I think that those spaces are, before you jump in and start cleaning it up, they're spaces that you could potentially look at to see what's there and see what you can utilise. And like I mentioned earlier, we're not just looking at things that you can utilise in terms of food. We'll get to the list a bit later about some of the creative ways that you can actually utilise your foraged finds. Observing the edges in your own garden system, both on a micro and a macro scale. Every little space in between plants is an edge, for example. Getting to know your area. If you're concerned about safety, this is a really good one. When you get out and about and you get to learn about your area, you see the patterns. You see the patterns of human movement, for example. Where do the dogs like to go? I know there's a spot around the corner where it just seems like all the dogs like to go there. So I would definitely not go there to be foraging any leafy greens, for example. But, when you walk around, you can see if a place is lush, an area is lush and happily growing, and it's been like that for ages, then, that's a pretty safe bet that it's not being sprayed. Sometimes it is a bit of a risk, I guess, and that really just comes down to personal choice, but it's just about making informed decisions, and you can do that when you explore your area and get to know it. So Bill Mollison talks about land access in chapter 14, and I found this really interesting. And I just wanted to briefly mention it here because it ties in with the other slide where I was talking about interaction with the land and also social norms. So we've gone from land stewardship, we've gone from a model where we had the commons and we had allotments, and maybe not so much in Australia, maybe in Australia too, but certainly in other countries, European countries particularly, where there was common space for people to use. And we've shifted away from that, and with land being sold off, to ownership. And with ownership, we have boundaries. And like I said, plants don't always follow the boundaries. But it does make me wonder, as we move towards that process of just ownership, what happens to communal space? And thankfully, we still have a lot of communal space. And thankfully, we've got things like this potential verge program, but we have our community gardens. We have agriculture in schools. We have, privately owned communal spaces, whether it's church land, for example. There's so much space out there that's actually wasted space. And there is definitely an opportunity to utilise that space, at least to get conversations going. And I think this is really important. And it's one of Rosemary Morrow's principles, where she talks about bringing food production back into cities. So I think that coupled with foraging and coupled with verge gardening and making use of the existing spaces, we can certainly look at ways to, increase that land access. So the how. Okay, here's another shot of me. I modelled for a lot of these photos. Does anyone know what that plant is? Any guesses? Anything in the chat? Oh, yes, we got something from Kerry. Thanks, Kerry. Chickweed. Do you know what? I used to hate this plant. I honestly did. I used to hate it when I was farming, until I realised that, I really had no reason to hate it, and it wasn't my enemy. It was a friend, and it was a really good bioindicator as well. And so I think, I'm going to really expand the definition of foraging here tonight, and I invite you to as well. And that is that when we change our relationship with weeds, we can actually forage information. We can forage knowledge about a place. And chickweed often tells us that soil is fertile and that it's high in nitrogen. But it's also very medicinal, and it's also quite palatable, in fact. And it's even on trend with some of the high-end restaurants. So there you go. Before you go and rip it all out like I do, or used to, see if you can find a use for it. And if you don't want to eat it, if you've got chickens love it as well. So there's just so many things you can do with it. And I'm going to leave that for you to look up and find out. But certainly a very useful plant, and a great plant that just pops up. If you create the right conditions, it just pops up in your garden. Okay, so the how of weeding, the how of, foraging. So again, start with observations and interactions. Build your relationship with your area and your community. That was one of the things I mentioned before. Observe patterns. What are you noticing in the area? What things are popping up a lot in your area that can be utilised? What's popping up in your garden? Creating a bit of a wild food diary or a map can be useful, and maybe sharing that information with interested friends or community to lighten the load, or to just share the bounty. I actually have trees that I visit on an annual level, and they're like, it's funny. I have relationships with these trees. I kind of get excited. Like, I know that mid-October I'm going to go and see the Mulberry Tree that's 2 blocks away from where I live, and it's perfect because it's not growing on anyone's property. It's a tree, so the fruit's high up. It's not being impacted by any of the passers-by or contamination. It's huge, so there's plenty for wildlife. There's plenty for anyone that wants to pick from it. We tend to pick from the bottom, so birds eat from the top. But in picking, we're limiting the amount of seed that's then going out into bushland. So we're kind of essentially doing some weeding and a bit of weed control. And I just love it so much. And it's labour intensive, so you only can really pick a certain amount before you just think, okay, that's enough. So you're not going to overdo it. And it's a great one to get kids involved as well. My son loves it. There's things like that you start to form relationships about and you get excited about. So I find that another thing that I derive benefit from foraging is the sheer joy and experience of being able to feel like I can eat for free. I can momentarily think outside of our modern society and really connect with nature. And I love food, so for me to engage that sense of taste and touch and smell, it means a lot to me. So hopefully it's something that might inspire you as well. Team up with people. Don't go it out alone. First of all, you look more legit, and also, it's something that people will find it easier to approach you and talk to you, and it's a learning opportunity for them as well. And obviously, there's a lot of other benefits to doing that. Bring the right tools. Sometimes that's just having a vessel to put your bounty in. I usually have a knife and a pair of secateurs in the car. So that's cool. And I usually have something to put stuff into. But generally, I kind of plan. I have a bit of a game plan and I head out. And then, picking the best time of day to pick things. Sometimes it's just about opportunity, the right place, right time. But sometimes you can plan it. For example, some flowers don't open up until the middle of the day. So that's not normally a time you would forage, for example. But depending on what you're going to pick, that could be a good time to forage. Any questions or anything at this point, or we're still good? Yes. Oh, yes, Pisto, I just saw that comment. Okay, so the what? Well, the what? The what it is so extensive that, we could spend forever here. But this is a poster I found of some really common wild plants in Australia that are probably more likely to be found in your garden. So as far as, say, starting off, they're really good options. And just looking at the poster, they all look very different to each other. So, they're good ones to start with. Has anyone actually foraged any of these particular plants before?
Suzie, I'm looking at Rambling Dock. It looks an awful lot like turkey rhubarb to me.
Yeah. Well, it actually is. They're calling it that, hence the rambling. But turkey rhubarb is actually related to dock.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I have certainly foraged, I'm going to say, all of these except the amaranth.
Yeah.
And the mallow. I don't see mallow around here at all.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't really see it much either. I have seen it in some locations, but not really where I live. I seem to get a lot of at the moment. I'm getting the south thistle and the good old scurvy weed as well. There's a fair bit of that in my garden at the moment. It's a native, but it's definitely exerting its dominance in the understory. We actually use amaranth. I've got a few varieties of amaranth that we grow for as an edible flower for decoration and for food styling. So yeah, that's a cool one.
Okay, I'm just re-looking at mallow. How big are those leaves? Are they tiny?
They're about I'd say smaller than the palm of your hand.
Okay, so I've got something with very, very tiny leaves that looks like that, but it's not mallow.
Yeah, and it's very prostrate, but then we'll send a spike.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
Barbara's mentioning that Robin has got heaps of mallow. She's a little bit north of us.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so different soil. I think it prefers it doesn't. Well, I don't know. Is she coastal or? Because it likes a wet. Really. It's sort of wetter. It doesn't like our sandy.
Morrisette.
Okay.
I was saying Morrisette.
Yeah. I've grown to appreciate fat hen. It used to, a friend of mine used to just harvest it and put it in everything, and I think I got a bit over it. But then I read about its medicinal value, and then I kind of went, all right, you're back in the good books again. It's funny, the relationships, it's like forever changing. And that's what I love about this stuff, because it constantly challenges me. I like being challenged. I like having my, my perceptions and my perspectives and thoughts challenged by information. And that's why I love foraging, because every time you think you have an opinion about a plant and then you find out something about it, it's like, there's respect, really. I form, and that's probably what really changed. That was a big turning point for me with bush regen and going from, just focusing on wanting to really take care of the natives and thinking that weeds were bad. And certainly they can be quite invasive and displace not just flora, but fauna as well. But at the same time, they offer so much value, and it just seems really wasteful to not appreciate and utilise that value where possible.
You've just changed my mind on scurvy weed. I didn't realise you could eat it, and it's everywhere.
Yeah. On that foraging page, there was a couple of recent posts that were put up, and one in particular used the flowers as dye, and it was really impressive. So, there's always layers of knowledge too. Like I know about scurvy weed, that's Commelina cyanea. I know about it really well. I utilise it, but now there's another wow factor that's been added to it through that information. And so that's another thing too, when we talk about stacking functions in permaculture, like we kind of stack knowledge as well. We don't have to know everything all at once. We can start with some basics. And then with the basics, you can stick and stack and add more knowledge to that. And it becomes, a lifelong affair, really. It's not an overnight thing, I don't think. All right. I'm not sure how I'm going for time. I'm sorry if I'm rambling on a bit. I can probably speed up a bit. Oh, whoops. Okay. So the why. All right. So this is a very text-dense slide. I apologise. But I just wanted to include it, and I did it in the form of the sustainability triangle being, social, economic, and environmental. And the reason I did that is because oftentimes when we're all speaking permaculture talk, we understand what it's about. But quite often when we're trying to actually communicate that to the general public or to decision makers, sometimes it's good to also look at it in a different way. And certainly when you deal with businesses as well, they're always concerned about the economic side of things. And of course, economics plays a really important part of the whole sustainability model. And without a doubt, like when you forage, you are actually saving money, or you have the potential to save money. So, you know, that can be a really big draw card for a lot of people. But I really like that, the sense of belonging. And I think one of the, maybe it's the foraging guide that Milk would have, which is a good free resource that you can access. They talk about that in terms of pattern recognition and sense of belonging. And recently I had to read an article for uni, and it was about how to assist refugees with acclimatizing and integrating to their new environment. And, you know, that comes from that sense of belonging. And they found that it actually came through the way that they interacted with the landscape, through the way they interacted with plants, and particularly through the action of being able to go to community gardens or being able to forage, that when they recognised the plants that they knew from home, that, you know, it gave them a sense of belonging and actually improved their mental well-being. So I thought that was really interesting. Again, when we think of something like plants and foraging and weeds, and then think of the far-reaching benefits that they can actually provide us, it's pretty cool. And of course, yep, environmentally sustainable. And yeah, I'm actually really interested about this thing with passive land use and active land use. I think when we go out and enjoy the surrounding landscape and our public spaces, often it is in a very passive way. And I think foraging allows us that little bit, pushing that boundary that little bit, when we get to actually actively engage with it. And I kind of like that a little bit. But yes, it's less packaging, less food waste, and transportation, less of that too. That ties in with another of Rose's principles, where she talks about reducing our eco footprint. I think that foraging definitely offers us that.
Suzie, there's a question there from Melanie. Melanie? Yes, Melanie. Do you have to be careful how you eat some forage foods? For example, is it true that it is better cooking fat hen rather than eating raw, as it can be high in nitrates and oxalic acid?
Yeah, definitely. I think, like anything that we forage, and did I jump ahead too far? Sorry. Like anything that we choose to forage, we really need to do our research and understand it a bit more. And I think that is actually a great opportunity to learn and to discover. And I view that as an opportunity to increase my knowledge and my, curiosity, as opposed to it being a chore. But certainly I think that that's a consideration. And if oxalic acid is one of those things that you really have to watch, then certainly there are some things that you would probably not forage. But again, with a lot of foraged foods, often because they're so nutrient dense, often just having a leaf here or a leaf there. If I do like a mixed forage salad, oftentimes I really am just pinching like a leaf or two off a few different things and mixing it with what I have. So I'm not really consuming too much. So yeah, no, that is definitely a really good point, Melanie. Okay, I think we're getting close to the end. I'm not sure if I jumped too many slides. I'm just going to go back. Oh, yes, no, that's cool. All right. So now to the exciting part. I'm just going to switch on my light. Sorry, guys, because I can't actually see. So much better, because I actually had a bit of a brainstorm the other day when I was sitting in the park, and I want to be able to see my notes. Okay, so I guess, we've had all of these things to think about and consider, and why foraging is so good and why it's like, eco and all that sort of stuff. But ultimately it comes down to, what can we actually derive from it? And I think that's where the fun really begins. It's just limited by your own imagination and by the imagination of everyone else that's on Instagram and Facebook and so forth. And luckily we have these opportunities to be inspired by what other people do, but also just to create ourselves. And I went to a festival in Tassie a couple of years ago. It was like a winter festival, and I was so amazed because it was such an it was a phenomenal event. There was composting and like no one was throwing out anything and everything was recyclable and reusable. It was so good. But all of the art installations were actually made from all the prunings from the orchards next door. And I loved it because it just kind of made me go, oh, like, this is so cool how they, like someone was just creative and utilised what was otherwise a waste material and was able to actually breathe new life to it, but also extend the experience of even coming into contact with these things, which for a lot of people, we don't often get to do that. So I just thought that was really cool. So I love seeing how people utilise their foraged finds for art. It's a great way to engage kids too. And that's why I've included that picture in the bottom left corner with leaves. But yeah, so using it for decor, if you're really clever, being able to build things from what you forage, particularly woody weeds, and obviously food, medicines, using ingredients or foraged finds in the garden. So using it to either, create green manures. So you may collect seeds, for example, a combination of grass and leguminous weedy seeds. And in doing so, you're preventing those weeds from spreading further in the bushland. But you may then choose to grow it in your environment in a very controlled setting where you're not allowing it to finish the life cycle and therefore, self-perpetuate. But in the meantime, being able to make use of the benefit that it can provide, which is enriching the soil. So there's lots of benefits like that that you can utilise. Bamboo, often, if you live close to, if you're backing onto bushland or you live anywhere close to, say, like a relatively moist, fire break or windbreak or whatever the case, bamboo is one of those things that you tend to see growing outside of people's gardens, so out like those boundaries that we were talking about earlier, exploring those boundary lines. That's a great thing that you can use in the garden as well, whilst you're also weeding it out of the bushland or weeding it out of your own garden or property. Using these plants for educational purposes. So, for example, there are a few foraging workshops that you can participate in where it's just really about appreciation, going out and looking at what's out there and learning about the historical or cultural notes of a plant and the history of its use, for example. And quite a lot of people just enjoy that just for the pure knowledge side of things. So, yeah, education is a really big thing. But also we can use these things for habitat. We can make a weed tea out of it. We can use them for our own health, just either directly or in a passive sense. So, for example, when you go out and you're foraging and you're wandering about, you're exercising. So there's all of that incidental stuff as well. I'm not sure about what I would use for cleaning products, but I thought it was worth exploring, so I popped it there. And yeah, so they're just some things. When it comes to food, I think I'm going to, I'll get to that. And of course the Formosa lily. I don't know has everyone been seeing these lilies all over on the roadsides, the white lilies? They're quite weedy and they do grow from a bulb, but I think that if you pull them out or if you at least cut the flowers off, then you're stopping the seeds from spreading. So, and then you can put them in a vase. They're actually still a commercial lily and sold at the flower markets, even though they happen to also be a bit weedy on the Central Coast. Another good one like that I've often harvested and then created a floral arrangement at home is the Aram Lily. But of course, you know, you're limited by your imagination in that respect as well. And another one, which is I'm noticing a lot of people starting to get into it, is the extraction of dyes. So here we've got dye from cow's lip that's been used to dye a yarn, but also dyeing fabric. And another thing I'm seeing is a lot of spent leaves and spent grass fronds that are being collected and then dyed with weed plants, like, for example, the yellow coreopsis flower that pops up everywhere on roadsides, produces a blue dye, which is really cool because the flowers are yellow. So, yeah, again, there's just so much that you can do. It's it really just comes down to what you're thinking about. Now, someone mentioned something about seaweed, eating and foraging. So there's a picture of me just here in the corner where I'm collecting some beyond the high tide mark. And so if you, I think you're allowed to get the equivalent of 1 bag per person per day. Yeah, but, you know, you can look that up. I think a lot of these things you can actually just look up, and there's a lot of information out there that you can gauge or asking your community as well. But in this instance, I do know that about seaweed. And I use these in the garden. I use it in my compost. I sometimes just keep it soaking in water, and then it just, once it's in fresh water, it just kind of really goes mushy and dissolves very quickly. You can dry it, you can probably grind it or blitz it up and make seaweed powder. I guess it really just depends on what you want to substitute. And in terms of substitution, I think that foraging materials are really good for that. Often when we think, well, how do we use them or what should we use them for? If you think of it in terms of what can I substitute by using something in the wild. For example, as someone mentioned, the chickweed pesto, for example. So rather than having to use basil or rocket, you can use other things. So I guess, yeah, that's a really good way of thinking about things in terms of how you might make use. In terms of edible seaweeds, again, I'm going to refer to Milkwood in their book that I don't remember the title of. They have a whole section on foraging seaweed. But one of the ones that we do forage locally, which I really like, and it's in wintertime, is Sandy going to go and get the book from the shelf? Yep. Is the sea lettuce. I really like that. It's the very light green looking one. And I don't remember off the top of my head how much you're allowed to forage, but I guess if you just forage what you want to use and not, you know, a quantity, that's obviously for commercial reasons.
Suzie, the limit on seaweed is 20 kilos.
Is it 20? Okay.
Yeah, you can take 20.
Because I was thinking my big Hessian bag, which is about...
You can take 20 kilos in one go. The issue on the Central Coast is don't forage after storms and check contamination levels, because often the seaweed locally, it will bioaccumulate. So the heavy metal content in it can be toxic. So you need to be really careful in terms of if you're harvesting it to eat it, go to an area where there's not a lot of housing pumping sewage into the water, and
yes,
and don't harvest after storms when there's been a lot of groundwater. It's another sad example of how we're messing up our environment, sadly.
And I think when we make those connections, then we sort of take those, you know, work it backwards and go, well, if we did less of this and less of this and less of this, then we could do more of this, 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 and this. And so it's like that spiraling in and out. And that's why it matters that we change our other practices. I think when people can see that link and the connection, it becomes easier to do. So with the seaweed, another thing too is that anywhere, like while we're talking about exploring margins, anywhere where we have those margins, the interface between two different ecosystems, in ecology, that usually presents a situation where there's a resource sharing. So the idea of this seaweed getting washed on the beach isn't just this incidental thing that takes place after a storm. It's actually a biological process that takes place, an ecological process that takes place, and a lot of organisms actually rely on that as well. And so I think in that respect too, it's important to, never take too much. And it's not just about, oh, I'm here to take my 20 kilo bag. I think it's important to look around and go, well, actually, if I was to take a 20 kilo bag today, right now, is that having much of an impact on what I'm leaving behind? And if the answer is yes, with any instance when we're foraging, if the answer is yes, I think that, that's a consideration. It's different if it's like you're picking a noxious seed pod or something versus, obviously picking something that is also a resource for other organisms. And, again, coming back to Rosemary Morrow, she talks about respect for all life as one of the principles that we should follow. And I really think that that's a very important one that means a lot to me. So, with anything that we do, there's the limits that we're told about, but then there are, our observational limits as well. So, plenty of ways that we can use things. Think outside the square. This year, I collected a whole heap of woody weed prunings and then created an arbor for my tomatoes. And I also got some orchard prunings from rootstock that shouldn't have been growing. So technically, you could say it was being a bit weedy, and then use that to train my beans up. So, it's just really cool when you start doing these things and then get creative, and it just becomes a snowballing journey, I think. All right, I'm nearly at the end. Thank you so much, everyone, for being so patient. This is my year. So I just thought I'd throw in a few things that I've come across. Not so many weeds, but because we have spoken a bit about weeds, I thought I'd share a few other things that I've encountered in my journeys across the landscape. And as you can see, quite often there's a lot of actual food that we can forage, not just weeds. Pretty exciting. So one of my favourite finds was actually this year, the chestnut, and that was in downtown Balmain, growing just on a verge. And then the olive tree as well was across the road from it, and it was spilling all over the road. So I was like, okay, I'm going to go and knock on a door here. Anyway, I think that's all I have to speak about. If we have any further questions, or if anyone wants to discuss some of the things that I've presented this evening, please feel free to unmute yourselves and share.
Suzie, I've got a nice foraging story for you. I think one of the best sources of foraging can actually be your neighbours. That when you get to know neighbours, particularly those who aren't very familiar with permaculture, it's amazing what they have in their gardens. So we invited our neighbours to be the clients for our group design for the PDC, and identified that they had a bunyannut tree in their garden. And they're from the UK. They have no idea what bunyannut are. They've never seen them before. We've now had, how many nuts do you reckon?
15 or 20.
Maybe 15 or 20 nuts. It's the first time the trees ever fruited is since we did the design for them. And they're giving us all the nuts, and we're passing them on to the Indigenous community, who just happened to be having a gathering on the Central Coast this year. So Gabby Duncan from the Darkinjung Land Council has been beside himself with joy, because they've had it's a traditional food for gathering of Indigenous people, and to have bunyannuts to share has been really special. And
that's amazing.
There's also a bunyannut up the road that routinely drops them down onto the gutter, and I stopped to pick one up, and this young man's jogging past, and he saw me. He said, "Oh, there's heaps more up there under the trees." And I said, "Yes, but the law of foraging is I don't trespass on private land." And he said, "Good news, that's my place."
Oh.
So he helped me fill the car with bunyannuts, and now his wife has booked him to come and spend a day learning permaculture here, and he's going to enroll in our next permaculture course.
Awesome. So
I
good.
love the way you talk about foraging as being not just about the food, it's about the relationships as well. You know, these connections that we make through this food is really special. So thank you for that. That's a really lovely perspective.
Can I quickly just share a story on that? I know I've done so much talking, but it's one of those things where you think, oh, do I want to put myself in that uncomfortable space of approaching someone? And so this lily pilly, the magenta lily pilly, which is profuse on the peninsula and probably the nicest tasting lily pilly I've ever encountered, I mean species-wise. It was just, I noticed that it was landing on the footpath and staining it, and it seemed to be a problem. And, you know, like the problem is the solution. Ever since I've heard that, it's become my mantra. And so I just went up to the door and knocked on the door and said, look, I would love to pick some of them on the fence line, on the street line, so that you don't have to come out and clean it up. And if you've got a broom, I'm happy to sweep the seeds off the footpath so that no one trips over. And he went, oh, that'd be amazing. And he said, actually, and any of the extra bits that you've got, like, because there were some branches that had broken off, he said, oh, I've got a goat. I want to give it to my goat. And then I was like, have you got a goat? It was just like downtown Edelong. So I was like, can I see the goat? So then I went and had a look at the goat, and then we fed the goat. And then I promised him to bring back a cake with so these bunya nuts I had collected at that same, like within a week prior. So made a bunya nut and lily pilly cake and then took it back. And he said, I was going to cut that tree down, but now that I know that you're around, I'm going to leave it. You can come and harvest every year. So I now have license to harvest at will. And again, that was just a conversation. That's all it was. And the worst that could have happened was that they said no, but maybe in saying no, they walked away with some information. And so in which case the job was still done. Yeah. So any other stories?
Not a story, Suzie, but just a question from Barbara and myself. You've got an image of some persimmons in a basket there. Did they ripen off the tree?
Those,
Yeah.
do you know what? I can't remember. Yeah, so that was a case of, that was actually on a site, a riparian site, and like it had fallen into the creek. And so it was crushing other natives. And so I was like, you know what, I'll have to dig around and look for photos and see if, because this photo would be about 8 years old. Yeah, so I can't answer that question, unfortunately.
That's okay. I was getting
But it was a photo opportunity and I did forage.
Thank you.
Now I'm going to find the answer to that. Thanks for asking. Yeah.
What is the little red things on the right hand side? The in your hand, they're tiny red.
Oh, in my hand. Let me see. Let me move. Oh, yes. Okay, that's actually a semi-parasitic tree. It's a native one. It's called Exocarpus capriciformis. It's also known as cherry ballard.
Right.
And it has a naked seed. So the seed, it's like almost like cashew. The seed sits outside the fruit.
Oh.
So it's a like conifer type plant. So it's in the gymnosperms. It's not like a flowering plant. And it's like it's all around the coast.
Cool.
Yeah.
Hey, Sandy is asking, we have a small lily pilly tree, which has now produced berries for the first time in 8 years. Are these fine to consume?
Okay. Well, all lily pillies are edible, but some produce more fruit than not. So it depends on which species it is. And also, having said that, there are a lot of cultivars, and I don't really know much about the lily pilly cultivars and their edibility. So if you know what lily pilly it is, sorry, I'm getting a bit tongue-tied tonight. If you know what lily pilly it is, or if you can share a photo or something, we can perhaps work that out. Yeah. Are the birds eating it?
Sandy, you can unmute yourself if you want to talk directly.
I haven't seen birds eating them,
Okay.
but they're gorgeous sized mulberries.
Okay, so maybe it's fine. I mean, I can't say obviously without seeing a picture, and like I said, it could just be one of our native lily pillies, or it could be like a cultivar or something, in which case I don't know much about the cultivars. But also we do get lily pillies in Southeast Asian countries, or some, like the jambos, which does the really, really big, I think it's Malaysian, or I don't know. Is Karen around? Karen might know about, she knows about ours.
Karen has just had to drop off the line. She sent a big thank you to you, but she had to go a little bit early, unfortunately.
That's okay. I know where she lives. I'll track her down.
Thanks, Susie.
Cool. So, okay, can I ask everyone a question then? How does everyone feel about, just on a societal level, I guess, how do we feel about people foraging from us? That's probably a good place to start, because I think it's one thing to go, I want to get out there and forage, but if you saw someone walking past picking something from your fence line, how would you feel about that?
I have a actual special garden with a little sign next to my deposit your chicken scraps box, and I beg people to take my herbs.
Mm-hmm.
Because it makes me so sad that how much money people pay for them.
Mm.
So I take the herbs, please take them. I'm never going an entire rosemary bush, very rarely, I have to say, and I don't know why, because they're perfectly good, they're right there. Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? I think sometimes people, but this is the point. This is the point that I'm trying to make about all of this stuff, is that we've somehow, somewhere along the line, we've been told a certain story about what is right and not right. And yet in our history, in all our histories, most likely, foraging has played a part. And so I just, and that's kind of not entirely foraging. It's kind of more like a share thing, but it is foraging to an extent, because I think ultimately foraging is obtaining food for free that you didn't grow yourself on land that's, well, it doesn't even matter if it's your land, because I forage for my own property all the time. So, yeah, that's interesting that people don't seem to want to do that.
Yeah, I think it's about building the relationships first. I mean, as you know, my garden's like a community nursery for anybody who wants to come here. And I routinely, but because we've built community locally using a geographical Facebook group, so I routinely get people message me saying, hey, Meg, have you got, so even last week, someone sent me a message, I need basil, mint and parsley.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, maybe I am super intimidating, but people are happy to drop things off to my chickens. And I think I have good relationships with people, but there's something about actually taking the herbs. And I don't know if maybe people don't do the same kind of cooking that I do, but I've got everything out there on the front there.
I think it's the cutting them. You're not super intimidating at all.
Oh no, she is.
I think it's the cutting of them. Like, people ask me, and then I cut them and I leave them in a little jar of water, and then they pick them up. Whereas if they don't pick it up though, like I work all day, it'll just dry. Yeah, but I do think people, like Graham's parents, come to stay and I say help yourself to the garden, and you come back and everything's still there and they haven't touched it. And there's a thing about actually cutting a plant, they're worried they're going to kill it.
Mm.
Yeah, I got really excited because I thought someone had taken all of my chilies, and then it turns out that someone was a possum. So I put out a little jar full of chilies, and I caught him red-handed.
That's kind of like foraging as well, isn't it? So I mean, we're here to share with all living things. It didn't go to waste.
That's right.
It's amazing that they can eat them though. I've had like possums eat, well, not where I am now, but previously, and they strip the tree, or like the plant, and you just kind of go, oh, well, what's your palate like?
Yeah, wallabies as well.
Yeah. Mm.
Hey, Suzie, if you stop sharing, we can.
Oh, yes, of course, I can do that.
On the screen. No, that's cool.
Yeah. Let me.
Okay,
Great.
brilliant.
So were there any other questions? Okay, someone said purslane. Yeah, I love purslane. And feeding purslane to your chooks increases the omega-3 of the eggs as well, which is pretty cool. Yeah, purslane. Clara, for your chooks?
No, my girls are a little bit spoiled, so they get like leftovers from the whole neighborhood. So they don't do a lot of foraging themselves. There's this native grass that grows naturally on my lawn, and they really love the seeds from that. But otherwise, they're kind of eating like watermelon and strawberries and blueberries and bits of dino pasta and like crusts of bread.
I love this. People are already offering what they have, so it becomes like a pay it forward foraging experience. I think that's a really cool idea. I love the produce swaps, and I love all those ideas, but this is yet one more potential way of doing things, by going, okay, I know something, it's been positively identified, I have more than what I can utilize. I'd like to, put it out there for others to enjoy. Yeah, that's great. So I did see a question up here, but I have to scroll, or a comment at least. I'm trying to scroll back to it. Where was it? Where was I at? I did that. Oh, sorry, it was Green Girl said, yeah, polite to ask, yeah. And some people just don't know how to harvest because they haven't been taught how to harvest. I understand that comment that you made, Gary Kington, about, people not harvesting, about people not harvesting when you give them permission, because sometimes people are scared that they're going to hurt a plant and they don't know. And, of course, like a lot of herbs are fine to give them a good cut. And then other plants are like, what have you done? What have you done to that plant? So, yeah, I guess that's why I talked about the barriers, because sometimes it's about understanding, well, what's stopping people in the first place? Because those are things, when we have that information, we can address them. They're not things that are, going to stop us once we know what they are. So
I love that photo you had of the sign on the post with a pair of clippers on a chain. And I was thinking, I wonder, would that work here? Because I've got a lot of herbs in my front yard, and I do encourage foraging because I've got cherry guavas on a hedge at the front, and people do come in and ask, like people I know, but I'm trying to encourage people just to come and take. Like I always put things out on a bench, on a chair thing I hang up, and put like any excess stuff there. Or if I do, if I'm say pruning the rosemary or something like that, I just put everything there, and it always goes. Everything always goes. But as Clara said, people are less inclined to come and ask or just take without it actually being made available to them.
Yeah, with my garden, because I'm out there a lot, because I run it as a business, I put my head up and kind of make eye contact with anyone that walks past. And I now have a lot of people that stop and chat. Yeah. And I have the kids that come and play in the little verge garden because I leave sticks and stuff. And so they'll come each day and go, what stick has she left today? And it's so cool because we've just got this like non-verbal interaction, non-interactive interaction happening through, me leaving these sticks out. But yeah, I love chatting with everyone, and I think because I'm out there all the time, they just they're curious to see what I'm doing, because it's like obviously I'm growing a lot of stuff there. Why? And yeah, often I'll give people cuttings and or even be like, oh, here, smell this leaf. It's a bit harder now with COVID. I think that's definitely you know, maybe some people are scared that if they pick up something from the side of the road that they might get contaminated. I'm not sure how it's impacted. Well, I know that it definitely has impacted the way that we interact. Hopefully that's something that can change.
You know what, I think it's the identification issues too, to those of us who are familiar with these things. You know, I can spot basil at 20 paces, but if you're not sure, you know, you look at the plant and go, is it rosemary? Is it basil? Where when someone else has cut it for you, now you trust that it is what they tell you it is.
Yeah.
But, you know,
so maybe labels.
Well, we take that pattern recognition for granted. We forget that there was once a time when we looked at it all and saw random plants and didn't know what they were.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, true. There's lots of thanks in the people who are, a few people have dropped off and just said, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful talk, and it has been.
Oh, great. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate that. It's, you know, obviously it would be great to be able to do something like this face to face and where we can interact and actually look at plants. But yeah, hopefully there was some value in my mumbling.
Well, it got me inspired. I was thinking I'd love to grab some of the locals. Clara, I'm looking at you, and I'm wondering if a few people are local and go foraging one day. I think it would just locally to sort of create that map, as you said, of what is where, and have an idea. Like we have people down the road who grow more lemons than they could ever need, and they often say just come in and get them. But it would be nice is to actually know where everything is and have that community where people knew they could ask or come and grab.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess these things take time to get going, but that doesn't mean we don't try and we don't start, because when we start, like, then you also sometimes see these big shifts as well. And certainly, like, whenever, you know, you watch those gardening shows and they'll profile an area and go, this street's doing this, or this neighbourhood's doing that. And I love hearing about places like that. Or, you know, this school now does this. And I think, you know, sometimes it's just purely through the actions of, you know, just one or two people just to get things kick-started.
Well, already in the message, there's a heap of people who will be in that. So, I'll be in touch.
Oh, that's so good. Fantastic.
It'd be great.
See, you just have to ask.
Yeah, I know. It'd be great fun.
Yeah. Well, if anyone's in the Woiwoi area.
You might be aware there are some places that actually put together a foraging map where, you know, people who live in a local area actually volunteer and say, you know, I have a lemon tree and here's when the fruit turns up, and anybody who wants to. So they actually like physically draw up a map that shows what people have hanging over the fence and the fact that they're happy to share it.
Yeah.
So could that be like an, oh, sorry.
I saw I read a comment that Frank wrote. Go Frank. Warrigal Greens from 1984.
Wow.
The Georges River, well, that area's that's where Diego does his walks, doesn't he? His foraging walks and talks. Yeah.
I think this is a new subsection on our permaculture page. We'll just form little local groups. So I'm in North Coast of NSW, and I know there's a few of us here, and Rhonda's in Batto Bay, and she's keen to meet up with a few people. So this could be really fun.
Yeah, I'm happy to go out of area. I mean, absolutely. Like, just foraging, it gets me excited, and I want to get out there and be a part of it. And I think I'm a good asset to the team.
Oh yeah, well you would be. You'd be able to.
I'm already putting my resume in.
Come and join our group.
But I was going to say this kind of could be a cool subset of the idea of like a, you know, like a what's that? The trail. Yes. What do they call them? Like a harvest trail or a garden trail. It could be like a forage trail.
Yeah.
And it could be like a, you know, like a forage gang, and you meet at a set location and it's once a month or something. and
Yeah.
you know, someone documents the journey so that it can be shared with people that aren't able to come along, or people that might have mobility issues but want to know.
Yeah.
And want to have that access, because then it becomes more inclusive, but also it's an opportunity to share, and then that's information that's tangible, because you can use that to then look at what's in your own area. So it could be a form of ID. I don't know. Ways to engage and interact.
That's great.
Cool.
It's going off in the chat. Cool.
I keep seeing 7 new messages, 6 new messages. I have to read them. So sorry, did someone, I don't know if that was to me, where do I live or where does someone else live? But I live in Woi Woi, in case anyone wants to know. And I'm happy for anyone to come foraging with me in this group. Yeah. So, and in fact, there's a couple of spots that I want to get out to really soon, because it's, you know, we're coming into autumn. So,
Suzie, I'm thinking maybe you might like to think about putting up some foraging type workshops.
Yeah.
And I know that, you know, people would be happy, I think, perhaps to pay for the opportunity to spend an afternoon with you and learn from you and do a bit of a forage and a wander. And of course, you'd be very welcome to promote that via the Permaculture Central Coast page. And if you need a hand setting up the humanitics or any of that sort of stuff, you know I'm here to help.
Sure, thank you. Thanks.
That is such a great idea, because that's what's stopping me. I feel unsure about what things are. So if you do run a course, I think a lot of people will be in for that. Yeah.
Oh, cool. That's great. Well, I would love to, and it's definitely been something I've wanted to do. Despite how I might sound like a radical, but I actually really do respect the rules, and I have actually approached council about this, because I do do some contracting to council. I just wanted to have their permission to be able to actually use some of their space. And it's gone into a bit of a grey area, so maybe I need to go back and start that conversation with them again. Yeah, but certainly there's nothing stopping us from going for a wander and, you know, not necessarily harvesting anything, but just looking at plants and identifying and, you know, talking about how or which parts we might use, or seasonality or whatever. Because if that's kind of like one of the big things is, and just even how to read the landscape in terms of potential contamination or things like that.
So I can help you out with the common law. The common law is that foraging on common land is legal, as long as you don't remove an entire plant.
Okay, great. So that's good to know.
So larceny involves asportation, which means removing something to another place, and if all you're doing is harvesting from it, that's completely legal.
Okay, great. Well, that's good to know. Well, in that case, let's go for it. Yeah, I think that'd be really cool. Okay, great. Well, I'll get my thinking cap on a location and get back to you guys.
Excellent.
Oh, so did anyone have any other questions or anything else that they want to mention or comment, or before we before I check in on the kids being the cats and my son?
Can I ask?
Well, there were the kids that I always say, be kind to your sisters. Sorry, Kath. I say, be kind to your sisters. And he's like, they're not my sisters. And it's like, yes, they are. Yeah. Sorry,
hi,
Kath.
Suzie.
Hi,
Hi, Suzie. I just have a question, and it's not to do with foraging. It's more about from your bush regen knowledge. At work, I go for a walk at lunchtime, and there's this whole great long line of fence that's got moth vine growing on it.
Moth vine, yep.
Is that something that should be reported to anybody? It's so long, it's so prolific.
Yeah. So I guess who owns the land? Is it council land?
No, I don't think so. It's funny. I think maybe Osgrid. It's sort of behind.
Oh, okay.
It's on that funny corner next to Henry Kendall High School, where it comes down to a corner onto Showground Road.
Oh, I know where that is. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know that exact spot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I walk past it every day.
It's a tricky one because if it's not noxious, like if it's not actually listed as a noxious weed in our LGA, then like there's no real legal requirement to remove it. So there's different classifications of noxious. And so, like noxious level 1 is like you must remove and eradicate, for example. And then noxious level 2 might be suppress and don't let it spread. And number 3 might be you're not allowed to sell this, and so forth. And I don't think that that's actually listed as one of the noxious plants. That's not to say it doesn't behave like a noxious weed. That's kind of more a political thing than an environmental thing, because there are a lot of plants that should potentially be on that list that aren't, and that's in some respects because it makes council's job easier.
Okay. Thank you.
But Osgrid, I guess they would be interested if it was interfering with their access to, their equipment or whatever. They certainly, like RMS and Osgrid and those types of organisations, do certainly engage in some form of regen, particularly when it's on their land and there's an obligation to do something about it. But in that situation, I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's. I don't think it's being used for that purpose. I think it's more being used for storage.
Okay.
So
there's no harm in reporting it. Certainly, because you never know. They may have a budget that they have to use up, or maybe they're due to maintain that area. Like, you just never know what's on the cards. So I think at the very least mentioning it, if you have the time to do that. Or if you have a photo and you could perhaps send them an email, that usually if it's written, then they would have to reply. It's courtesy to reply. Yeah. Okay, so thanks. I hope that's helpful. Oh. All right. Well, I think that's probably it from me this evening. Thanks.
Kerry, did you?
Oh.
Okay, Kerry, I get the hint.
Sorry, Suzie, I meant to unmute
please, thank you, because otherwise I'll summarise 3 times. No, thank you. Sometimes I need a little, push along.
Well, other than that, doing this, muting you is quite effective, right?
Thanks, everyone.
Suzie, just before you sign off, there was one more question there from Green Girl saying someone used to eat the fruit. Have you heard of that? I'm assuming she's talking about moth vine.
Moth vine, yeah. Well, it does look like, what's that plant that I don't really like? Choco, yeah, that's it. I don't know why I don't like it. It's one of those things, it's like a boundary I have to explore. It looks like it, but every time I've seen it in its fruit form, it kind of splits open and sends flying seeds everywhere. And it's quite tough and woody. So, yeah. Look, I think most plants do have some type of use, or, when you dig around, like most plants have had, someone's explored them at some point or another. So I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know what else to say about that, because I don't really know personally whether it's edible or not.
No worries. Well, Suzie, I think everybody's just been absolutely riveted, and really got a lot out of tonight. And I really want to thank you and honour the fact that you kept weaving it back through the permaculture ethics and principles and making reference back to some of the, wonderful permaculture textbooks. So that's always absolutely wonderful when you can do that as a speaker and make permaculture really live and breathe for everybody, especially if there's people that are less familiar with permaculture. So thank you so much for all the work you put into the talk, and really the anecdotes that just have really made it live and breathe. So thank you. And whenever you got time for the workshop or workshops, please let us know. That would be awesome. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
You. And good night, everybody. And don't forget the Morag Gamble talk next Tuesday night. So the Zoom link